Back, everyone, and we're on to our next session, which is on the economic benefits of flexible spectrum networks. And our first speaker should be familiar to anyone who's been interested in the economic benefits of license-exempt spectrum. I'd like to welcome Dr. Raoul Katz, President of Telecom Advisory Services and author of a number of reports or research reports into the economic benefits of license-exempt spectrum. Welcome, Raoul.
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, please turn on your webcam as well.
I will indeed. There we go. And if I could have the slides of my presentation, please. Or should I actually share my screen for my slides, or someone will? Oh, there we are. Excellent. Okay, very good. So as you see here, let me just, I apologize, I'm trying to see. Steve, can you see my screen?
No, I'm unable to see your screen. I was under the impression the organizers were sharing it, but...
Hi, Dr. Katz. We'll run the slides for you.
Okay, very good. So then, very good. There you are. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the economic impact of spectrum sharing. And as it stands, Steve was mentioning some of the reports we've been producing in the last year or so for DSA that is primarily focused on the making the 6 gigahertz band available for unlicensed use. My scope in the presentation is a little bit larger since it's talking about spectrum sharing, and as such is trying to depict why spectrum sharing is critical from an economic standpoint for both the development of the economy, productivity of enterprises, and consumer welfare in general. So if I can, if you could turn to the next slide, please. So spectrum sharing is not a new thing in terms of the management of spectrum, or the radio frequency spectrum as a whole. On the left-hand side, you have a number of bands that have been assigned through different standards for the free use or unlicensed use by a number of developers of devices and applications. And it goes through the lower bands on the RFID all the way into these different super Wi-Fi application of WiGig. And each of them have been critical over the years in terms of allowing the development of new devices, new applications, and as you can see, they go all the way from at the bottom asset tracking and highway toll systems to the management of smartphones, tablets, operations of peripherals within the household and within enterprise campuses and the like. So what you have is a universe of applications that have been enabled. The word that was used in the prior panel was that of ecosystem, applications that have been enabled by the ability to access this spectrum on an unlicensed basis that is shared by a number of manufacturers and software developers. Next slide. How do we measure the value of spectrum sharing? On the left-hand side, we have 3 chevrons that explain the three sources of value that are critical. The first one is by making spectrum available for unlicensed use, what happens is that it becomes an enabler of complementary technologies. That is to say, technologies that complement existing one and therefore compensating for the limitations that another one might have. A classical case is the one that we're dealing with right now in terms of the complementarity between 5G networks and 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi applications in terms of its indoor and outdoor capabilities. The complementarity of both, or what Wi-Fi operating in 6 gigahertz is doing, insofar that it complements the 5G wideband applications, is that by doing so, we provide superb quality in terms of wireless service, independent of the location that we're at. So unlicensed spectrum in that particular case through 6 gigahertz allows for this complementarity between Wi-Fi and wideband technologies. The second source of value is that of alternative technologies. Essentially, what happens is consumers get benefit as a result of not only prices, but also choice. We want, in general, regulators want consumers to have a larger access of the possibility to access a number of technologies and have the choice to determine which technology, which communications platform they are going to use. And clearly, in this context, the availability of Wi-Fi, for example, gives consumers the opportunity of lowering their wireless spending. A critical phenomenon that is occurring in the course of COVID, when we see like 60% roughly of the time that smartphone users are connected to the network, they do so through Wi-Fi as a way of reducing their expenses on their wireless plans. And the third source of value is that of innovative business models, because unlicensed use of spectrum prevents those operators that hold the private right to a license to establish a holdout effect. A holdout effect occurs because they can actually become a gateway to providing the authorization for an innovator to bring a new product to the system. I'm going to refer to history. When I was advising Steve Jobs in the development of the iPhone, and we're talking about 2005, a critical element of putting that iPhone in the market was signing agreements with wireless operators to allow that iPhone to be offered in the marketplace. And that had to do with what kind of revenue splits we're going to be incurred, whether there are going to be any subsidies or not. And from that perspective, I could say that while the technology was developed already at Cupertino, the time that it took to actually get that iPhone into the market was dependent on whether Apple could sign up agreements with each of the wireless operators, not only in the United States with AT&T, but in the rest of the world. So three sources, again, of economic value for unlicensed spectrum or shared spectrum: complementarity, alternative technologies, and the ability to develop innovative business models. Next slide, please. In particular, if you actually decompose those three effects in terms of different applications, and here I'm putting some of the examples that we've been studying over the years, the complementarity occurs in terms of residential Wi-Fi, for instance. Every one of us, when we are at home, we operate our smartphones through Wi-Fi. We don't continue accessing the wideband network as a way of controlling costs. Offloading of the networks that provides the ability for operators to reduce their capital expenditures in terms of base station deployment, speed in wireless applications. On the alternative technologies, there's a whole range, but here I'm citing three of them. One could be alternative reality and virtual reality and the Internet of Things, as well as all the whole suite of residential Wi-Fi devices, between wireless speakers to the whole set of alarm systems and the like. And within innovative business models, in particular, I would like to highlight WISPs, because it's a critical way by which internet service providers provide access in rural areas, isolated areas, or for those users that cannot afford the purchase of a wireless mobile broadband plan. And let me move to the next one to highlight the value of WISPs in particular. Look at the situation of the digital divide on a worldwide basis. What I'm focusing here in these numbers are the people that do not access to the internet today on a worldwide basis, and the people that are not covered by either 4G, the prevalent wireless technology, wideband technology, and or fixed broadband. And what you can see is how big that digital divide is, and how harmful it is in terms of preventing these populations to actually address some of the needs that are triggered by the current COVID situation. If I don't have access to the internet, I cannot do e-commerce, I cannot educate my children, I cannot access to telemedicine. And if you see, for instance, in cases such as Africa, 71% of the population today does not access the internet, and in a large portion of those, it's because the networks don't reach their territory. This is not a situation only in Africa. You can see it in Asia Pacific, and even to some degree in North America, where there's a portion of the population today that aren't served by conventional broadband technologies. So in that context, the wireless internet service providers provide a platform to address some of these problems. Next slide, please. How do they address it? And this is a classical sort of a network architecture of a wireless internet service providers. You have different points through this different elements of that network, whereby the spectrum, the unlicensed spectrum, can enhance the capability of reaching to a larger number of subscribers. And by virtue of the economics of the fact that these operators don't have to pay for spectrum, they have the opportunity of preserving the low cost of access with which the affordability barrier is addressed to a larger degree. So the WISPs can both enhance the coverage and the ability of more unserved people reaching the internet, and secondly, do it within an economic framework that is more affordable than that is provided by classical broadband operators. Next one. The other application that is critical, that is becoming more prevalent, particularly within the current environment where the world regulators are discussing the allocation of the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed use, is the notion of congestion at the residence. What occurs, and this is what we've been studying for a number of years, ever since we provided supporting materials to the FCC in their decision of the allocation of the entire 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed use, is that when you get a broadband line, a fixed line, roughly in excess of 150 megabits per second, and this is a conservative threshold, your router becomes congested at the device level. This has been critical, and we've all experienced that when we are confined and we're doing sheltering in place at home, and we have the heads of household and the children getting access to cloud computing, video conferencing, and the like. The router definitely cannot handle this intense use of broadband capacity, and that with only 2 bands that are essentially allocated for Wi-Fi, in this case 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, the router becomes congested. And this is the opportunity whereby the allocation of 6 gigahertz becomes important in terms of allowing a faster access to the internet, which in and of itself has an economic benefit, and obviously a more consumer benefit for new applications. By the way, this type of effect occurs not only at the residential level, but also in enterprise locations. And you might wonder, well, you might ask, well, how many lines do we have that represent 150 megabits per second? Well, it is interesting that in the case of the United States, by virtual analysis that we've done for the FCC, it's rather large, the number of users today that are receiving service in this category, and it is growing even in the developing world. Next slide, please. The final, and I'm trying to rush because of my time constraints, in terms of the ecosystem implication of unlicensed spectrum is the development of augmented reality and virtual reality. Two types of technologies that are critical in terms of the increase on productivity and the enhancement of capabilities at, let's say, the enterprise level, as you can see in the chart of the left, either on healthcare impact, maintenance in oil and gas industry, as well as operations training for the mining industry. And this is through a number of verticals. But more importantly, what I want to emphasize is that AR/VR has an impact on the ecosystem, but this is not just a matter of an impact on those that manufacture hardware. Because if you look on the chart on the right and see how the worldwide market for AR/VR is evolving over time, what you see is the primary component is software and content, which is something that gives most of the emerging world, I'm talking about the Brazils, the Mexicos, the Kenyas, and some of the countries that have developed a capability in terms of software and content development to place a role in this particular area of ecosystem development. Next slide, and my final one. So to sum up, spectrum sharing has been going on for a while, ever since the first Wi-Fi decisions in the United States. That has had an impact on the ecosystem that has been developing in terms of technologies, ability to consumers to enlarge their choice of technologies, and enabling new business models. That has had an impact on the growth of the GDP, the savings for industries, and the enhancement of consumer benefits. And in particular, it has been critical in addressing the digital divide, which in my sense is a critical component of the challenges of the telecommunications industry as a whole is facing in these difficult days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Katz. That was a short and very explicit presentation, very much appreciated. And now we are going through a dynamic that is a little bit different. We are going to have a discussion, a fireside chat discussion between Monica Paolini. Monica is the founder and principal person at Sensafili. And we have had a lot of discussions with Monica in the past about the future of spectrum sharing and new technology. So we are very glad to have you with us today, Monica. And I think you're mute, just in case.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. I just was waiting for you to keep talking. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to have this conversation because this work in trying to understand the value of Wi-Fi, other spectrum sharing, is absolutely crucial but at the same time, it's incredibly hard to do. You know, just think about you're trying to assess the value of something like Wi-Fi that we've been using for 20 years that we cannot even imagine not having. So it's a very difficult thing. It's much easier to, you know, look at the value of something that just is new. So it's a really challenging thing, and Wi-Fi permeates so many aspects of our life. So with that said, now I have the opportunity to ask a lot of questions, hopefully. And so the first one is, you know, we all know Wi-Fi has a good impact, economic and not just economic. Can we try to go a little bit deeper? And how do you define what is the value that technologies like Wi-Fi, wireless technologies have compared to the fixed connectivity to the home? Because if I'm at home using my Wi-Fi, I have also broadband connection to the home, and then there is Wi-Fi. I can use Wi-Fi in public hotspots. Can you tell us how you go about it and what is the contribution of each? Because people could say, well, it's just the internet it's the internet connectivity. It's not Wi-Fi that adds the value.
Yeah, no, that's a very important question, and one of the reasons why it has been difficult, or it is difficult, to actually measure the value of Wi-Fi in particular, is because, or any unlicensed application that I'll talk to, is that contrary to the private use of spectrum through a license, you can stipulate that the value of the private or the license is that one that operators are willing to pay at auction. So there's a single number. When you have unlicensed spectrum, and as I shown in my presentation, you have a wide range of applications. So almost you have to start building one by one the different sources of value. But if you focus on Wi-Fi, let's focus on Wi-Fi at home. I mentioned one of them in particular, and let's think of COVID right now. The study around the world, and this is Open Signal indicates, is that smartphone users rely between 60 and 70% of their connect time on Wi-Fi. Well, essentially what's happening there is I'm not using my data plan to access the internet. I'm saving money. That's a benefit for myself, number one. Number two, in the household, if I have to connect a range of devices that are within the household, going for printers, scanners, PCs, tablets, and the like, we very rarely, although some users do so, rely on Ethernet cabling. We just rely on Wi-Fi in order to connect the different devices. The cost of deploying an Ethernet cable within the household is rather important. We've estimated this. It could reach up to between $1,000 to $2,000 per household. It's in the United States, roughly, it's between $600 and $1,000 for just a 2-bedroom home. So you rely on Wi-Fi by contracting the router. You're saving on the cabling standpoint. The third thing is the speed at which I'm accessing my different devices, particularly if I'm getting 6 gigahertz modems. But basically, it has been proven through research that the faster you access internet, the more you have an economic benefit. And there's an impact because there's an efficiency in the transfer of goods and services, efficiency of using applications. So all these start building up, and suddenly when you get to the overall economic value, that's where you get to sizable numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to go to sort of expand more on the digital divide on your last point, but before we go there, I want also to ask you, sort of along the same line, the sort of competition, so to say, with fiber, which is a perceived competition because you do need fiber in order to have good Wi-Fi at some point. So the two obviously go together, but sometimes I hear the sort of like the line of question goes, well, it's just fiber that brings the value, you know, it's not, or that's really the crucial bit. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on that.
That's a misconception. I mean, the fact is, let's assume for the sake of the argument, as I shown in my presentation, that I'll give you a real example. I don't have fiber, but I have cable modems, and I'm purchasing a service equivalent to 1 gigabit per second. It's a 1 gig service offered by many cable providers in the United States. The connectivity in the home is through routers with 2 bands. I mean, a classical bi-band router that is offered by the cable operators. Well, while in theory, if I were to hook up through a cable to the cable modem, some device, I might be getting 800 megabits per second speed. But if I have only 2 a bi-band router, the actual speed that I'm getting at my device, at my PC, the one that I'm talking to you with, is roughly 100 megabits per second. What happened between the 1,000 gig, the 1 gig and the 100 megabits? Where is the erosion on the quality of service? It's the congestion that I was referring to before. So yeah, I'm getting fast to the point of getting to the cable modem. But if I don't have Wi-Fi with 6 gigahertz, that is to say, 3 bands with the ability to utilize channels of, let's say, 160 megahertz channel or even more, I'm not getting the quality that I'm purchasing at the modem level. So yeah, fiber is important, but so is the complementarity that Wi-Fi gives in order to access the value of fiber.
Yeah, so and you really need the two. Now let's go back to your last point, which was the digital divide. That's I think it's really important. And when you look at the GDP contribution, what is there a difference in terms of the size of the GDP contribution in a sort of developing country versus a country like the US, where we tend to have more, we can use more, we can get more benefits, say, from the cellular network, and we might depend we might depend less on Wi-Fi. So how does that affect the GDP contribution in countries with little connectivity, lower connectivity, or lower connectivity options?
Yeah, I mean, clearly the sources of value change by country. This is not a cookie cutter approach when you say, well, we assess the economic benefit of Wi-Fi and we just, on a blanket statement, we look at every country. In the case of the digital divide, as depicted by the numbers that I've shown in terms of the unserved population, what Wi-Fi gives by enabling the wireless internet service providers to do is to lower the affordability barrier, which in developing countries is critical, enhance the coverage, and by that, you increase the number of broadband users. Now, from a GDP standpoint, this has been studied for probably 15 years. We've done a number of studies for the ITU in particular. When you increase the number of broadband lines, you have an impact on GDP. Now, you might ask, well, why is that? Well, it's markets, because suddenly new operators of business models have access to a larger set of acquirers of services, more efficient transfer of goods and services. It takes me 1 day to receive a good from Amazon if I push it through, if I order it through Amazon through my wireless application. More efficient use by enterprises that didn't have that kind of utilization. So there is a whole relationship between number of broadband lines and an impact on the GDP. And that, for developing countries, is critical. Now, if we were to do an analysis, which we've done for countries like the United States, the effects are of a different nature, because obviously broadband coverage in the United States is, we have roughly today in the United States, approximately on fixed broadband, 85% of households. This is pretty large, as all advanced economies. So I'm not going to get a big return from a social standpoint, from a digital divide standpoint in the United States, but I do get it on the development of the ecosystem, on the use of AR, VR for enterprises for productivity effects. So that's what I'm saying, that these changes according to the country. And on the last note, the digital divide, sometimes we can measure in terms of pure economics, as I did before, number of lines. But I think that in the current context of the COVID-19, this becomes sort of a social need. The notion of inclusion is critical to enable people that today cannot access the internet to get plugged into that world. Because if you're not plugged into this world, you cannot do teleworking, you cannot do education for your children, you cannot access telemedicine applications, you can barely purchase goods and services because you have the transaction cost of going to the point of sale to the supermarket is already important, particularly if you're sheltering in place. So socially is a critical, and it's more difficult to apply a value. How you're applying a dollar value to the fact that your kids can continue going to school by virtue of having an efficient, broadband service.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at, for instance, telemedicine, if you can imagine that if I get the medical care that I need today, that expands my life expectancy for a year or two, there is a huge economic value there, but it's very difficult to capture it through Wi-Fi or whatever, it's there, but it's kind of difficult. Now, let's go to something that is a little bit more tangible. And sometimes the argument you make, and the people make, especially like mobile operators in favor of licensed spectrum, is that if you license the spectrum, there is a revenue that goes to the government that it's lost when you have unlicensed spectrum, but then you have a different GDP contribution to that. So what is the answer to that? And also, when we think about GDP contribution, there is clearly a contribution to the vendor, to the ecosystem, and all of that, to revenues, to various service providers. But how much of that is really going to benefit the users, people like us, versus the economy as corporations, service providers, and things like that?
Yeah. Also, in your question, there are two topics. One is the issue of what happens to the license money when you go to auction those revenues. And it's an interesting question. How much of those dollars, or whatever currency you're collecting the license costs are, go back to the economy as a whole? In fact, we've been analyzing these over the years, and for many parties in the telecommunications industry, and there's a whole erosion of the value of the dollar over time. What I'm trying to say is that for each dollar that is being collected at auction, in the best of countries, what I mean by that is those that have the most efficient administration of the public good and public services, approximately 50 cents get back to the user in terms of new services or new coverage. The numbers are even worse if you look at universal service. Is how much of those dollars actually would go back to deploying infrastructure or subsidizing the deployment of infrastructure in isolated areas. The problems in terms of managing those revenues and making sure that the consumer actually receives that value in some way, shape, or form is very difficult, and that's particularly in the developing world. Now, the second point is how much of this GDP contribution actually makes it to us. What we've seen is the effects are different types, but and we're engaged in doing some of this work for the Inter-American Development Bank. Once a consumer, or let's say a household that doesn't have broadband connectivity, gets hooked up to broadband, the average income of the household increases. So let's say you have two heads of houses because their children don't work, but the two heads of houses have some income derived from their work. Well, what happens is that first, they get better knowledge of what's out there in terms of new jobs, the ad market, so to speak. Second, they can promote themselves better in the internet world. I can offer to the world my CV, my resume, and saying, I have these capabilities and I'm looking for a job. Third, I can get some long distance training. So I can actually get some training through the internet for some skills that make me more marketable. So what we see actually is that in areas that are uncovered by broadband, that suddenly receive broadband, the average income for the household increases. That to some degree goes into the GDP because in fact, if I'm making more money and the increase over a year is roughly 7 to 10% increase, well, that goes into the consumption of goods and services. I'm going to buy food, or if I'm in a vulnerable class, I'm going to buy books and clothes for my children, and that goes directly into the GDP. So that's one of the effects that we see that are very important. The other one is on savings. It's on savings because let's say that as I was mentioning before, if I get Wi-Fi and I can get access to my wireless service at home, what was before my cost of prepaid, fees that I was paying the wireless service provider diminishes because I'm saving money. And what we see in that particular case is that, particularly in vulnerable households that are somewhat limited on their income, when they save in communication services, they allocate it to other areas, whether it's food, whether it's clothing, whether it's upgrades in the household and things of that sort. All those things go into the GDP and they're tangible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our time is up, but I wish we could go on for a few more hours because this is so fascinating to think about all the implications of something that we take for granted, but it's hugely valuable to all of us. So Earl, thank you so much, and I would like to hand it back to Martha. No?
Yes, thank you very much, Monica. It took me a moment to turn on my microphone and my camera. So thank you very much for that interesting discussion, and so many elements came here. And I think it's a perfect opening for the session we are just going to have after this presentation. Give me 1 second. Yeah, okay. So right now we are going to open the next session. It will be a panel where we will have some discussions about the role of wireless internet service providers in the region. So I would like to invite now, not as master of ceremonies, but as moderator of the session, Steve Song, who you have all met during these last 3 days. And Steve has kindly accepted to moderate the session because Jane Coffin had a last minute issue. So Steve, thank you very much for that, and you're welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sorry that Jane couldn't be here, but this, if I could pick any session to moderate, it would be this one. And that I'm very excited about the role of small internet service providers. Dave Wright from the OnGo Alliance used this wonderful metaphor the day before yesterday, or yesterday. He said that, if you try and fill a box with bowling balls, it doesn't take very many for it to appear full, but the box is obviously not full, and that there, are many smaller baseballs and tennis balls and marbles and even sand that can go in the box in order to fill it out. And I think that sort of, for me, sums up the potential that small operators have. And so our first speaker was to have been Basilio Rodriguez Perez, the president of the Federation of Associations and Chambers of Internet Providers of Latin America and the Caribbean, or LAC ISP. But unfortunately, Basilio was unable to be here. But happily, Martha has agreed to present some of his slides. So first, over to you, Martha.
Thank you, Steve, and I beg you indulgence in making his presentation because, of course, this is all completely on behalf of LAC ISP, and this is attending Basilio's request. So like LAC ISP, for those of you that are not familiar with them, is the Federation of Associations and Chambers of Internet Providers in LATAM and the Caribbean. And they are one of the 10 entities that is headquartered at Casa de Internet in Montevideo, Uruguay. You can see in the map the colors of the countries where LAC ISP is present. Next slide, please. And here you have the names of the associations. So this is a federation of associations and chambers. So they represent different associations from different countries. So for example, in the case of Brazil, Abrinci and Abranet are members of LAC ISP. Also in the case of Colombia, for example, NAISP, and in the case of Mexico, WISP MX. So these are some of the members of the federation. And as you can see, they have a regional coverage. Next slide, please. And well, the motivation of this Federation of Association is the integration of representative organizations of ISPs and wireless internet service providers. It promotes exchanges and of experiences and knowledge, and their purpose is to contribute to the development of universal access to the internet in the region. Next slide, please. Basilio wanted to focus on the Brazilian case because he thinks that it's a great example. Unfortunately, we are going to have Alex in the panel afterwards, so he can provide more details about the Brazilian situation. In this presentation, it's indicated that there are more than 15,000 ISPs, and 85% of them have less than 5,000 users. So as you can see, there are many providers focusing on a small number of clients, and that explains part of their coverage and their regional presence. There are just over 20 ISPs that have over 200,000 users, and 80% of ISPs operate with fiber to the home. Next slide, please. Well, in the Brazilian case, you can see here, according to the information, this is about different, these are the number of those providers that have their own ranges of IPs, and that is the total number of 7,624. Next slide, please. And this is something interesting about the market share. It comes from the numbers from the regulator in Brazil, Anatel. And you can see here on the timeline, and you can see the number of clients, the market share. So if you compare, you have in green color the Brazilian ISPs, and the other three lines correspond to the big telco in Brazil. So you can see that in the last, since 2019 to 2021, the market share of fixed access has been mainly covered by ISPs, and they have an important presence in Brazil. Next slide, please. It continues explaining, but in this case, it's the fiber to the home. And also we can see a similar behavior in terms of fiber to the home provided by ISPs and fiber to the home provided by big telcos. So you can see that the blue line, like in 2018, started to be more, the more providers were ISPs instead of big telcos. Next slide, please. So one of the messages is that there is a challenge of integrating the entire region, and that is important because there are so many ISPs that are providing services in the region, mainly focusing on those hard-to-reach areas or suburban environments, and many of them also in rural environments. So it's important to integrate the region in sharing experiences and best practices. There is a challenge to replicate the Brazilian case in other countries of the region, but of course, each country is at a different time of internet development and has different economic and political conditions. Next slide, please. And I think this is a final message that Basilio also wanted to share with the group, is that for LAC ISP, the challenge of unifying and obtaining common regulations for the entire region in the 6 GHz band is important. Many of ISPs rely on unlicensed spectrum access, and for them, access to the 6 GHz band and Wi-Fi 6E is very relevant. So I think that's the last slide. Next one, please. So yeah, exactly. So with this, I will conclude presenting Basilio's slides. Please feel free to contact him. You have his email address if you have any questions, and I'm sure we will hear more details in the next panel. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha. I think you know, in a forest, if you want to understand the health of the ecosystem, one looks for new growth, and And ISPs and wireless ISP associations are indicators of that new growth in a telecommunications ecosystem. And often the health of those ISP associations tells you something. Our next speaker is Claude Aiken, and he's the president and CEO of one of the most active and largest wireless ISP associations in the world, WISPA, from the United States. Welcome, Claude.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Let me see if I can get my webcam turned on here. Aha, excellent. Well, great to have the opportunity to speak to everyone today. I decided not to do slides today just so we could be a little bit more conversational in this. So thank you for the introduction. So WISPA is the Association for Entrepreneurial and Innovative ISPs here in the United States and around the world. We do certainly have some international members as well. We've got close to 1,000 members, the large majority of whom have under 250 subscribers. So these are small community-based companies with just a handful of employees that are filling in both the connectivity and competition gaps in the United States and worldwide, from downtown DC to the shores of Cyprus to rural Nebraska. We've got folks all over the place. And I think the high level message that I just wanted to leave with folks today from both a regulatory and a partnership standpoint is to cultivate the kind of innovation and competition that we're looking to see from the ISP space worldwide. You have to engage with and listen to the folks who you see the least. Now, I'm coming at this from the position of being a former regulator, and the WISP space was not one that I saw very much. I came across it early in my career back in 2009 when I was reading the blog of a relatively prominent WISP, and I had never even heard of the technology before, but they've been doing it for years. And then fast forward to 2020, 2021, and we see some of the largest wireless providers in the United States and around the world proclaiming the amazing innovation that they have just discovered. That's going to be the pivot point for them to really monetize 5G, and that is fixed wireless. So all that to say, and since we're talking about spectrum here, I'm going to share a couple of key ways that regulators can amp up wireless innovation and competition no matter where you are. And we've heard folks talk about this already, but that's shared spectrum and unlicensed spectrum. And thankfully here in the United States, we have a couple of very good key examples on that front that I'll just run through really quickly. CBRS, which is a spectrum band that I think many are familiar with. It's shared, it's licensed, it's got a lightly licensed component, and it's got a user share it component. So even if you have a license but are not using it, other folks can use that spectrum. And that's a fantastic template for spectrum access going forward worldwide to ensure that spectrum, even if it is licensed, is put to its best and highest use. Another aspect of that, for the portion that was in fact licensed and auctioned off, it was auctioned off on much smaller geographic areas than have historically been done, at least here in the United States. After the CBRS auction, we had here in the United States the C-band auction, which was done much more like a traditional wireless auction here with high power, large geographic areas. And we were able to get data from seeing those two disparate approaches that were taken here. So in the C-band auction, there were only 21 entities that won licenses. So that seems like a lot until you compare that with the 228 entities that won in CBRS. You had much more competition diversity in the CBRS auction as you did in the C-band auction. And the next statistic is even more stark. 97% of the licenses in the C-band auction went to the top 4 mobile providers in the United States, and less than 4% of CBRS licenses went to those same top 4 mobile providers. So if you're looking to incent engagement, deployment, competition, shared spectrum, and if you're going to license it, smaller geographic areas, making it available on terms that are attractive to the entrepreneur and innovator set are ways to ensure that that same precious resource is not allocated in a way that just goes to the folks who already have that critical infrastructure. And I think a good story and example of that is a WISPA member, Micrologic in West Virginia. Now, West Virginia is known in the United States as being an area that has very poor wireless coverage. Now, this is an operator that is providing fixed wireless service in West Virginia. And when I visited his company, he told me there's gigahertz of licensed spectrum right over our heads. We're here. We would absolutely make use of it, but the companies that hold it won't even give us the time of day, and there's no way for us to access it. If that spectrum was made available on a use or share it basis, we could have small companies across the United States taking advantage of these critical assets that the larger folks don't see the return on investment to utilize those, to make those deployments. So shared spectrum, critical to incenting innovation and competition in the wireless space. Dr. Katz, just before this, talked a lot about unlicensed spectrum. We at WISPA are also huge fans of unlicensed spectrum. 6 gigahertz, absolutely critical here in the United States. We're working through the standards for the automated frequency coordinator now that are going to be absolutely key to making the spectrum available and unlocking its value for gigabit fixed wireless service. And another key piece of spectrum that we see that's been made available on an unlicensed basis, but the equipment ecosystem is really starting to catch on fire here, is in the 60 gigahertz band, where you see super high speed fixed wireless being deployed and utilized with this unlicensed spectrum band by thousands of operators, not just a handful. So I guess in conclusion, I don't want to go on for too long, but to cultivate innovation and competition, engage with, listen to the folks you see the least. We're one of the largest, if not the largest, WISP organization worldwide, but we still, I still, when I'm talking to folks on Capitol Hill and in the White House, I still get that look. Well, what is fixed wireless? Who are WISPs? So it's still an uphill education battle a lot of times, and we see that even today in discussions around infrastructure, where White House data excludes fixed wireless when it's talking about what broadband is available. So all that to say is make an effort to listen to and reach out to folks who you may not be the folks you see every day in the halls of power, and particularly on the spectrum front. Shared spectrum, unlicensed spectrum are absolutely critical to innovation and competition here in the United States as well as around the world. And with that, I'll look forward to the rest of our discussion later.
Thank you very much, Claude. Yeah, I think often we forget that that SMMEs, small businesses, in many countries make up more than 50% of GDP. And I'm always reminded of this. There's a big poster on the side of the University of Ghent in Belgium that says the next big thing is a lot of small things. With that, I would like to invite Alex Jusius. He's the General Director of Associação NEO, which is a non-profit association composed of more than 180 ISPs in Brazil. Alex, bem-vindo.
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. Thank you, Marta, for the invitation. So I brought some slides here to talk about the challenges we face here providing connectivity in Brazil. So we are an association that's formed by small-scale operators here down in Brazil. So it's Associação NEO Association, NEO from New Operators. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So NEO Association is a not-for-profit association. We've been in the market for more than 20 years. We have more than 108 members. All of them are Tier 2 ISPs. Such as WISPA, most of them started as wireless ISPs, but during the time being, they moved the operations for GPON, FTTH, or cable. So right now, these members, they deliver broadband service for more than 7 million households. We cover around 4,000 municipalities in Brazil. Just remembering that Brazil has around 5,500 municipalities all over the country. And these municipalities that we cover represent 70% of all households in Brazil. We can move to the next slide, please. So if you talk about when you talk about spectrum, and then I saw the discussion between Professor Raul Katz and Monica, and about the base for delivering, having spectrum. You need to have a good broadband, a good fiber, good infrastructure, backbone, backhauls. So, and this is what we are starting to analyze, the revolution that the small scale operators did in Brazil the past years. So out of the fixed broadband market in the end of December of 2020, they had around 36 million households. Out of these, we have 41% of this market is provided by small scale operators. So 59% from the big players, the big telcos in Brazil. Out of this 41%, the association represents almost 50%, almost 50% of the market share. The average size of our affiliates are around 30,000 subscribers. But they're doing this not only with old technologies, they are using new technologies, but most of the new technology they're using is FTTH, such as we see in the presentation that Marta made in behalf of LAC ISP. Out of the 16 million FTTH connections in Brazil, more than 10 million are delivered by small scale operators. Next slide, please. When you deliver these connections through a good technology, of course you have a good connection. Out of this is minhaconexão.com.br, is a private website, local website in Brazil that measure internet speed connection by end users. At the top 10 ISPs in Brazil, that the fastest one, all of them are small scale operators. And you take the top 10 cities, the fastest cities in Brazil, all of them are small cities in Brazil. So the average population of the fastest cities for internet in Brazil is 160,000 inhabitants. So the small scale operators in Brazil are delivering the best fixed internet broadband experience in Brazil, not only fixed, but of course using always Wi-Fi. Next slide, please. The associations and the small scale operators, we attribute this success mostly because the resolution 69 for 2018 that was made by Anatel, that in our opinion is helping to reduce the digital gap, especially in the broadband market in Brazil. This resolution introduced a new concept for small scale operators. And this helps, of course, the creation of the asymmetric rules. So the small scale operators don't need to comply with the same rules, the regulatory rules that the largest operators in Brazil. By this new definition, there was an old definition, but new definition in 2018, any company that has less than 5% of the retail market share which operates, can be fixed line, mobile broadband, is a small scale operator. And this we see in the number of municipalities in Brazil. The result of this policy we see in the number of municipalities that right now don't have or have fiber optic backhaul. If you can see, before 2018, we have like average growth of 6.7%, and after this policy that Anatel implemented, we have like a growth of more than almost 11% per year. So you can see that right now in 2020, we have only 1,100 municipalities without a fiber optic backhaul in Brazil. So we understand that this policy helped to reduce the digital gap in the broadband market. Next slide, please. On the other hand, we need to work a lot in the spectrum side, because it's concentrated in 4 national operators that right now we have a merger in Brazil that probably is going to reduce to 3 operators. And when you take a look in the numbers, you need to, Brazil, of course, is a big country, but the coverage needs improvement. Only 35.9% of all federal highways have 4G coverage, and only 28% of all rural properties have a properly internet connection. So when you see the coverage of the 4G, even in rich states like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, we need to improve the internet connection in most highways in these states. Next slide, please. These numbers, we also can look not only the numbers that Anatel provides, but also sometimes are provided by the operators. We take a look in the crowdsourced mobile network testing from Tutelas, for example. That's a private company that measure the crowdsourced quality of the networks. And you see all over Brazil that they consider an excellent quality if you deliver the download throughput of more than 5 megabits per second. That's considered excellent, and a core quality is more than 1.5 megabits per second. When you take a look at the operators in Brazil, the best operator in Brazil delivers only excellent quality in 68% of the samples are delivered by the best operator in Brazil. And even states, so take a look in the states of northeast of Brazil, or take a look in states of the north of Brazil, only 30 to 40% of the samples are considered excellent. So we need more base stations. We need more companies exploring the spectrum, because as I don't remember exactly who said in the other panel that usually the largest operators, they choose the best place to put their network. And small scale operators right now, with the infrastructure they made, they are able to create create coverage with spectrum sharing in these places all over Brazil. Next slide, please. Regarding competition, so we talk about the coverage, we talk about the quality, and now talk about competition. Brazil is a market, as I said before, a market that's reducing 4 to 3 companies, larger companies for mobile operators in Brazil, and MVNO represents only 0.7% mobile market share. So if you compare with other countries, with China, Germany, United States, or United Kingdom, take a look at that, you see that all these countries have more market shares than Brazil. So you see that we need to improve competition in mobile space in Brazil. Next slide, please. And this slide that worries me more. So in terms of how much space you have to grow. So thousands of municipalities don't have any coverage, still don't have any coverage in many frequency bands in Brazil. So I choose here some of the bands: 700 megahertz band, the 850 megahertz band, 1800 megahertz band, and etc. You can see that in many of the municipalities you don't have any coverage. So thousands of municipalities, 700 megahertz. These numbers are from Anatel. Anatel delivered, informed these numbers last year. So you have thousands of municipalities in many bands that are unused and could be used through spectrum sharing policies. Next slide, please. Well, good news. Good news is since 2015, Anatel is promoting auctions that include small-scale operators. So, and in this auction right now, 2021, going to have a 5G auction in Brazil. They allow the entrance of new players, both can be neutral hosts or regional players in the Brazilian wireless broadband market. And as was discussed, I think the yesterday's panel. So Anatel also put some rules about spectrum sharing in the 5G auction. Just to summarize and to conclude, next slide, please. So Anatel symmetric rules, we understand that was key to reduce the digital gap in the broadband market in Brazil. So the small scale operators that are delivering, the leaders in the local broadband market, they're delivering the base the basis to deliver the network. So having the network, you are able to have the spectrum on top of that. So and they are delivering the fast internet broadband experience in the countryside of Brazil, especially in the countryside of Brazil. On the other hand, the mobile market, we still have a 36% of federal highways with 4G coverage, 28% of rural properties with internet connection. The crowdsourced mobile network testing show real data that we have poor mobile connections in most states of Brazil, and MVNOs with only 0.7% market share, and thousands of municipalities who still don't have any coverage in many premium frequency bands in Brazil. We have good news. We have the auction, the 5G auction in Brazil that allow the entrance of new players in the Brazilian wireless broadband market. But of course, we are small scale operators. We are pushing Anatel to promote unlicensed. We have a very good work with DSA here in Brazil to promote Wi-Fi 6E, the whole band, the 1200 megahertz band for Wi-Fi 6E. The license, of course, the 5G. And we still have to do a lot in terms of shared spectrum policies to guarantee that the small scale operators can deliver a better internet connection for the Brazilian population, not only the broadband, but also mobile. So these are my words. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm available for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Obrigado. I think what we've heard from you and from Claude and from Martha through Basilio's presentation is just how absolutely critical ISP associations are in terms of being a voice for small operators where they might otherwise not be heard. And in many countries, those ISP associations don't exist. So promoting the development of ISP associations, I think, is an important strategic goal. Our next two presenters are individual ISPs, and first we'll hear from Angus MacLeod, who's the Managing Director of Juicetel or Juice Telecom in South Africa. Welcome, Angus.
Can you see me?
Yep.
I'll just stand a bit.
Yep, we can see you.
Good. I was chased out of my office a short while ago, so I'm back here. Yes, I want to say thank you to Martha as well as to the DSA for the invite to chat. Steve, thank you for the introduction. Yes, I actually come from working in government as well, regulatory section of that. So we've got some experience there, and then obviously also working very closely with different MNOs. We've worked with MVNOs, and more recently with wireless internet service providers. But I think my take is mainly from a community perspective, and we've just driven our strategy away from becoming a focus on trying to grow revenue, but more on a focus on trying to see how the community can be given access, and from them getting access, they can grow themselves. And I think many speakers before this were saying exactly the same thing. So our focus is more on the people and less on the money. So let me continue. My presentation is very light. I think I'll throw around some discussion points about South Africa itself, very broad ones, but also very important ones for us, and from the experiences that we've had in the country. So for me, it's just very weirdly interesting that in terms of connectivity, how South Africa is set up. Most of the ISPs are concentrated in areas where they can potentially make money. And that's how it really is. So there's less focus on the rural areas. Even the MNOs have sort of a similar focus and less focus on these particular areas that require some sort of connectivity. The cost is generally expensive, and the other funny thing about it is that if you go to, let's say, for example, a Gauteng or a Johannesburg, you would be paying $4.99 as an example for a 20 or 25 gig package, and then you go down to the coast and East London, where I'm originally from, and it costs you almost 800 Rand there. So it's expensive firstly, and then it looks like from the bigger towns to the smaller towns, the price sort of differs. And the unconnected are that way because they are not viable. I think from an MNO perspective and from what I've seen is that there's less incentive for any provider to go into a rural area to go and assist those people there to be connected because it's just not viable. And that's what you see all the time. It's been like that for 20 odd years. What we also have seen is there's a deterioration of quality of service, and some people might want to argue with me about that, but that's actually just generally the truth, not just from my experience, but from people that I've been dealing with as well. And like I said, this is still true 25 odd years later, so it becomes difficult for people as you go along. You can go to the next slide, please. Let me just move this out of the way, and there we go. So there is a big push to roll out fiber across the country, and it's mainly concentrated in the populated areas, the urban areas, and semi-urban areas in the big towns or just smaller towns in South Africa. There's a focus on the sub 6 gigahertz, lots of players in that area, and then the other parts of the fixed wireless is also very popular. The very interesting thing is that even the MNOs are starting to play in the fixed wireless space. So it shows you there is a potential for fixed wireless to play a big role in terms of ensuring that people get connected. But like I said, it's again mainly in the areas of the potential to make money. The quality of service has deteriorated across all of the service providers. I think here where I am right now, it's a populated area, but the MNO is not able to provide proper service here, and you would expect them to be able to do it. The unconnected have some hope with various initiatives in the rural areas, and I think that goes because I think there was some spectrum allocated last year, COVID spectrum in South Africa. One of the SMMEs that was awarded national COVID spectrum in the TV white space area is the one that we work with to look at connectivity in these rural areas. But other institutions and organizations have also made an effort to look at connectivity in the rural area, but I think it's not enough from the sake of that. I think getting funding to do that, that's one problem. And just on the other side, like I said, it's just difficult to get people to buy into it as well. The COVID pandemic arrived last year, and this brought a sobering fact for us. I mean, the connectivity is not where it should be. Networks became very congested because everybody was at home doing work, and it was just a struggle to get connected, even in an urban area. So that showed that there was a potential for growth in terms of broadband in the urban areas, and you're still seeing that the rural areas are lacking from this focus. The regulatory environment, I think it works for some people and it doesn't work for others. I think the biggest factor in the regulatory side of things is that the cost of spectrum is very prohibitive for SMMEs. And I think on the other side, which is I think more important, is that people have spectrum that they could use in particular areas and give smaller organizations an opportunity to try to roll out some sort of broadband there, but again, not willing to share their spectrum. I mean, we've been through that exercise as well. When we tried to do a spectrum sharing exercise with a couple of the MNOs, eventually it just did not happen. Spectrum and facility sharing would make a difference, but ultimately, like I said, just not supported to the level where you'd expect. I think you end up sitting and talking, and the outcome of that is nothing. I think there's people that have opportunities to do stuff, but financial backing and general support is not there. Communities are the ones that actually suffer at the end of the day. So every piece of development or opportunity to grow something is done in these more built up areas or cities and away from where people should have the opportunity to actually be able to do that. And I think some of the speakers were talking about that earlier on. That we just seem to neglect those who actually really do need connectivity. And we don't realize that give somebody connectivity, it will give them an opportunity to grow whatever is around them, to grow potential for them to make more sort of opportunities available to themselves as well. Next slide, please. Okay, what could be done? So at that point where we made that decision, like I said, to focus on people. So working together to connect people is not only the right thing to do, and consequentially money and growth will be generated over time. I think when I talk to people about saying you need to put something in to get something out and it will happen over a longer period of time, it's difficult for them to actually understand that because their focus is on, I need to satisfy a shareholder or I need to make money to do this here. But I think if you start from the bottom with people and grow a network with them, it might take you 5, it might take you 10 years or even 20 years. But the effect of that is lingering for the years to come after that. And I think this is what the kind of push that we are pushing towards. Regulatory changes to facilitate enablers like spectrum sharing, facility sharing, equitable access to spectrum, innovative spectrum pricing for smaller players, infrastructure rollout by communities and service revenue sharing with communities, creation of localized ISPs. And I think that's one of the things that we are pushing. I'll share an interesting story with you. We actually just rolled out the TV white space equipment that we are working with the small SME called AABA. And we installed some equipment in a school. The moment we gave them access to broadband, it's just how interesting they came up with ideas of how they could generate revenue for that school. It's a no-fee school, and they said to me, Angus, we could actually just take this here now and look at ways to generate revenue from this year to arrange to have some fundraising initiatives. And that revenue would actually be put back into the school for them to do certain things. So I think there's a potential to do this here. I don't know whether that school could become, if allowed even, to become a localized ISP in one way or the other. But certainly when you talk to them, you can see just that connectivity, just giving it to them creates opportunity for them to do certain things as well. And they have the ideas because that is their community and they know what the requirements are there. So, it would be a win-win that people could benefit from, and not only the people at the school, but people right at the top in an MNO or in a WISP. if you work together. One of the things that I wanted to mention about wireless internet service providers that I know of, there's a particular one that's gotten very big in South Africa, but that's because it actually started buying up a number of ISPs across the country. It can work because things can be centralized, it can standardize certain equipment or processes or whatever. But I think when you start buying up the smaller ISPs in this area, you take in a particular area, you take away that localized element where there's an understanding of the community. And once you do that, then you can end up focusing on things like just making money. And eventually it moves away from actually giving people access to fix the quality of service. And we've seen that as well from this example that I'm talking about. Like I said, this could extend from what an MNO and FNO government and other infrastructure owners have to connect everyone, but more especially those citizens in the rural areas. So we could use these kind of initiatives where a community can be allowed to build out networks for an MNO, for a WISP, and so forth, and then obviously allow them to offer services there. I think it plays a role in terms of safety. It plays a role in terms of the looking after your equipment. So it will generate some economic activity in a particular area. And I think the previous speakers actually even spoke about that. So it was very heartwarming to hear that. What COVID has done is given the opportunity for connectivity to drive the growth of access, even solution developments. I mean, one kid in the rural area was talking about setting up a cloud business, but no connectivity, couldn't do that. So the ideas are there. Education, obviously agriculture, job creation, etc. But also the quality of service at an affordable cost. So I think one of the things that we focus on, because of my experience with MNOs and so forth, is looking at quality of service as important as the person that you are going to be serving. The moment you start focusing more on making money, you're going to look for the cheapest way to deliver something, and it will be a substandard product. And that's what I'm seeing in the last I would say couple of years as well, and it's still happening right now. Next slide, please. Good. So what are we doing? I think I alluded to it earlier on. We are driving the need for access with a focus on people and not money. Money is a consequence of this, and I think I tell people this all the time. If you do something well and you deliver that service, you will make money. It becomes a consequence, not your main driver. Sometimes it might be quick. In most cases, when you're doing this kind of thing, it will take time. We have looked at innovative ways, yet simple, of providing access to people. I think TV white spaces is one of that, one of those things that we are working on with the communities. The other one is obviously fixed wireless equipment. And I think both of those can actually make a very, very big difference in those communities. So I think our focus is really about getting a network out there and then getting people to engage with that network and starting to look at opportunities for themselves. Not me coming in and just offering the service, but helping them be part of that, including the rollout of the network and the maintenance of that. So training becomes a very important element in all of that as well. The equipment that we're using is basically a mix of old and new. So it's old DOCSIS technology with the latest of wireless. And from an end-loss perspective, for TV white space, we have a range of up to 50 kilometers on the fixed wireless, which is line of sight. That also has a range of about 50 kilometers. And both of these operate in the sub-1 right up to 100 gigahertz. And because it does that, there's an opportunity again for those MNOs who do have access to spectrum, but are not using it in the rural areas, for us to then take, for example, a 28 or a 29 gig, get the equipment to work in that band, and then give them the potential also to fulfill some of their objectives of reaching people in those communities as well. So I think this is the kind of thing that we're looking at as a company. So our partnerships start with people on the ground and working with them to create opportunities through our technology. I think what we're also allowing the MNOs to do is for them to also to be able to drop traffic on that network. But how do we do that with the community also benefiting from that? So that's what we are doing. So I think in conclusion, for us, we have really preferred to work together rather than to work alone. And we're already seeing the results of that within a short space of time. So yeah, very excited about this year, but I think we will be engaging not only the regulator, which is ICASA in South Africa, but also the MNOs, other operators, to see how we can leverage support and how do we go about actually going and putting out quality of service networks, but also networks that will allow themselves to evolve through the involvement of people in those communities that you want to serve. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you very much, Angus. I think you made a point that really resonates. That is the nature of circular local economies, where you have local operators that are reinvesting in their local economies. Our last, but by no means least speaker is Michael Gingold from Air Jaldi, founded in Dharamsala, India, northern India, I think back as far as 2005. I think Air Jaldi are proof that wireless ISPs are not just for urban markets, but can serve any kind of economy in any kind of terrain. Welcome, Michael, and thank you for staying up. I know it's late where you are.
No problem, and pleasure being here, and thanks for giving me the opportunity, Steve, Martha, and others. So indeed, as Steve was saying, we're an internet service provider, started in the small town of Dharamsala, northern India, where I'm speaking from at the moment, on an Air Jaldi connection. We started unofficially in 2005, but officially as a private limited company since 2009. And we have operations now in 9 Indian states. India has 36 states and union territories. So by no means covering this rather vast subcontinent. But today I will try, in as much as I can, not to really talk about Air Jaldi. I'm happy to talk about Air Jaldi, and if there'll be questions about that, I'll be happy to take them. But to try and actually talk about the subject at hand, which is spectrum sharing. And I wanted to kind of take us through this journey of how it might look from the perspective of a local ISP. This is not a theoretical perspective, this is a very practical one, based on what we have done and continue to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, on a very, very theoretical level, in a sense, before we dive in, how do you actually choose which technology to use as an internet service provider? And again, WISP is a great name, and we are a WISP. But increasingly, as many previous speakers mentioned, there's a drive towards FTTH, and it's a sort of a combined drive at the moment. But in any event, you're looking here at the theoretical case. Let's look at the upper graph here. It's, if you've got acquisition cost at the y-axis and you've got density at the x as the independent variable, as it were. And again, as I put in the parentheses, this could be other things. This could be topography, for example. You could take, mountainous to plains, and there are other factors. But in any event, each technology, and I've again, I can give names to these technologies, but I chose here to keep it a little abstract at the moment. You can have one technology that you start with that does relatively better with lower population density, and it continues to do so for a while. At a particular point, another technology steps in, and if it for lower densities it might have been unaffordable, it becomes affordable and performs better than the first technology, and then a third technology comes along. So you really have what you have on, again, the same graph. You have areas where technology 1 performs better, technology 2 then steps in as a better performer in terms of cost per density, and then a third and a fourth and an end technology. And again, that same thing plays along. Please bring it back to the previous slide. I guess it's got a timer on it, so I forgot to remove. So you really have this sort of interplay, and in a sense, again, if you look at the way you might be looking at it, and I am not in any way suggesting that on a daily basis we run these semi-sophisticated economic models, you have multiple cases or multiple cases of combinations of whatever factors it is that you are looking at. Next slide. So what you end up with, and I'll walk us quickly through this rather complex looking drawing at the right hand side in a second, is what what we call internally the WIT box, the sort of wireless technology toolbox, or the wireless toolbox. But it's also being able to keep your wits about, to know what is the right thing to do. And again, there's one quote here that I love, which is it's attributed to Abraham Maslow, but it precedes him. Is if your only tool is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. There is this tendency, and I think we're all at fault of it in one point or the other in our lives, to fall in love with a technology or a particular way of doing things. This is something that, as an ISP, and Steve, I know, knows India very well. We last actually met in India. In a place like India, which is a rather cutthroat market, make that mistake and you'll find yourself, gasping for breath. I very much appreciated Angus's emphasis on the need for meaningful connectivity, which is something that I believe in passionately. But meaningful without oxygen becomes a problematic proposition as well. The second thing is again, a sort of a somewhat a favorite biblical quote of mine, is that to everything there is a season and there's a time for every purpose under the heaven. Those of us who are fond of biblical sayings would know where that comes from. You really need to know what to apply, and when we look at our own realities as an internet service provider and operating in very, very different terrains. Some of them are plains in southern India, and some of them are mountains of the Himalayas. You're really looking at the combination, which in the middle of this drawing on the right hand side, you see the sort of the wireless spectrum. There's really a place for almost every part of that range, that if and when it would have been made available. You can start with fiber, of course, which is wonderful when you can have it. Has its own limitations and problems, as we all are acutely aware of. You then go on to the middle mile, and people mentioned the 60 gigahertz, I believe it was WISPA, 60, 80. These are really, really interesting. Of course, again, 23 as well. Very, very interesting ranges where a lot of very interesting stuff potentially can happen on the middle mile. I'll talk about potentially in just a second. You then have good old Wi-Fi, and we are prime users of Wi-Fi. As Raul said, the dual band, the 2.4s, the 5.8s, and whatever is thrown at us. You then have TV white spaces if and when available, and if and when usable. And you even have, and I've drawn that at the far right side of the picture, something that at least in this session wasn't talked about much, and that is satellites, and not the old satellites with their problems, but LEO satellites. It's definitely something that's going to play a role in years to come. Again, huge issues, not least illegal, but I expect it to be a meaningful player with relevance to us as rural internet service providers. I should have said, and I'll say now, that Air Jaldi's main areas of operation are rural. So that's our mission, and that's where we are. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, great. So again, from that same chapter in the Bible, there's a time to keep silent and a time to speak. So is this a good time to speak about spectrum sharing? And I think it's a great time to speak about spectrum sharing. And this is something that we as Airgeldi have been grappling with and dealing with from where we are. We're not an advocacy group. We're not an amalgamation of ISPs. We're an ISP. So it's from where we are and with what we can do. So when we look at this issue of spectrum sharing, and it's like, okay, if it's so great, why isn't it happening really, especially in a place like India? Our experiences taught us that policymakers and their helpers are short on three things. They're short on understanding of the issues. They're short of time, who isn't? And they're short of wiggle room. And that's extremely important. Their ability to actually implement what is right versus what is politically possible and plausible is to some extent and to a large extent rather limited by the constraints that they are looking at. So why is this all meaningful to us in this forum? Because I think that there are things that we can do on all three. For the first one, we need to be able to make clear cases for what we're advocating for. And when I say clear cases, I'm thinking of two things. One is, can we explain, again, I'm thinking of George Orwell's Rules of Writing English, of which some of you are familiar with. Can we make our proposition simple, such that we drive immediately and effectively to the issue at hand? What is TV white spaces good for? What is E-band great for? What is LEO good for? And why is Wi-Fi still relevant? And a million other questions. We also need to do the other thing, which is we shouldn't be overselling things. I think, again, sometimes our enthusiasm about what we're doing or a particular thing that we're advocating leads us to somewhat overshadow certain challenges, and I think it's a mistake. I don't think the effectiveness of an idea is weakened by showing its challenges. There's a toolbox. There's this thing called, I believe, a Birmingham hammer. You don't solve everything with a hammer, and you don't solve everything with a fine screwdriver. Place for everything. Again, time, the second thing, again, can we make it short? Can we make it sweet? Can we make it something that is long lasting because of that? I've sat through many 5-hour presentations and everybody walks out of them not remembering what we were actually talking about. And most of you have spent more times than I in conference rooms, I think. And the third, which is the really, really most important thing for me, can we help the policymakers find ways in which they can still drive a mission through the barriers that they are looking at? And those barriers are really, again, if we had to be very stylized about it, are really two. One is political. Countries are run by politicians, and the politician will finally ask himself or herself, what's in it for me? What's in it for my government? What's the benefit that I'm seeing in it? And when they're thinking about it, they're looking at the other side of the problem, which is the commercial forces in operation. And those forces, which are very considerable, would want to know, how will whatever you're doing not interfere with what I'm trying to do? And their interest is, of course, not to make things available on any form of spectrum sharing. And so can we, between those seemingly insurmountable obstacles, offer a path? And I think that there are many paths and some interesting ideas, which again are readily touted and available, are things like light licensing. I'm not crazy about light licensing. I think it's a bit of a cop-out, but it's a great way to get about things. The other thing is explaining that certain technologies really don't have problems of interference. Again, TV white spaces had this wonderful active map that was made available to policymakers. E-band has even easier soluble propositions. This needs to be made available to policymakers so that they can actually find a way through. And with that, operators like me can actually get to a point where the graph that I presented in the beginning will become a reality where we can really mix and match technologies to create the best of breed networks. Thanks a lot. I went a little over time.
No, that was great. Thank you, Michael. And I knew I could count on you to end on a kind of philosophical reflection on the market. And I think the metaphor of the toolbox is the perfect one, right? You know, we don't want to come to a problem just with one tool in our hand, but to have access to many. So can I ask all of our speakers for this session to turn their webcams back on, and we'll start a little bit of a discussion. I'd like to start with Claude, in that I think it's quite interesting that you know, across the countries represented here, we have the U.S. that has had TV white space regulation for many years now. South Africa that has just implemented, you know, finally the TV white space regulation and has deployed their first networks. Brazil, it's under consideration. India, maybe not so much, I'm not sure. But I think the interesting thing is, I mean, I've seen some critiques on the uptake of TV white space in the US. And my question to you, Claude, is what advice would you have for other regulators as they implement TV white space regulation to ensure its success?
Sure. Well, that's how long do we have? I think it's the question. I really liked you know, Michael's framing of trying to be solutions oriented at the end of the last presentation, and I think that's the primary advice that I would give, is to try to go in with an end use case in mind and say, this is what we can accomplish with these parameters, to the extent that that's a known quantity. And that kind of a case is pretty powerful when you're talking to regulators and legislators. I mean, we've had our own issues with TV white spaces here in the United States. The legacy broadcast industry has fought fairly tooth and nail to keep things the way they are, and it's been an incredible challenge to find, even with the implementation here in the United States, usable channels due to issues like tropospheric ducting and other technical things that I think we're beyond getting into. But having a clear sense of the art of the possible and articulating that, and you know, to build on what Michael was saying, it's not just what it means for the government; it's what it means for their constituents. What will their constituents be able to access, and what will they be able to do with this change to the legislative and regulatory scheme? I think we have a fairly good template here in the United States. There are some pretty serious tweaks I would suggest making, and I'm happy to talk about that offline. But at a macro level, that's the advice that I would give.
Okay, well, thank you. Angus, do you want to comment on that based on your sort of early experience of TV white space in South Africa?
Sure, yeah, I think, yeah, very new. I think what we've experienced, I think from our side, specifically when we talk about TV white space, is that we actually spent the time when it was awarded, actual spectrum was awarded last year. We spent a lot of the time looking for technology that could work within the country itself. I think towards the middle, towards the second part of the year, we found the equipment that we required. But I think in terms of TV white space, there's been some sort of support from the regulator. We're working closely with them. I think at the end of this month, we're going to go through what we have and how it works. So, you know, I think from our side, it's a case of saying we're going to see what's going to happen in the next year or so. I think fortunately for us, we have managed to roll out something and it's working. So I think we're going to continue doing that going forward. I think the best results will come as we go along. I can tell you this, though, from using TV white spaces, the reason why we actually decided to use it is because I think it has the potential to get into those rural communities where we really want to go. What we have found is that in discussions with people in municipalities and so forth, is that there's a great support for us to take it out into those areas. So yeah, been very interesting. The one thing that we do know that's a problem, and just listening to what Cloris has said now, is that, for example, with a very built-up area, urban area, and I think the other speakers might be able to relate to this here, you can only use 1 or 2 channels, and those are the only ones that are available for you to use. So we've been using a single channel, working with a TV broadcaster called Centec in South Africa, and we've been using that to push our TV white space solution. We're getting about 28 to 30 megabits per second off the one channel. And interestingly enough, what we're doing is we're taking that analog and converting it at a base station to LTE and delivering LTE to the consumer or to the customer. So they just need an LTE router to receive that. And like I said, the idea is there, the will is there, and I think we're getting good support from people in the communities, the local government, and also some of the operators.
So I think that's a good opportunity to shift gears a little bit, in that I think the potential of TV white space for rural access is fantastic, but there are obviously limitations. You know, for instance, in the amount of spectrum available, perhaps in the manufacturing ecosystem that to support that. But one area where the manufacturing ecosystem is not limited in any way, but is rather seems to be exploding, is the LTE manufacturing ecosystem, with the growth of new standards like Open RAN and dynamic spectrum initiatives like CBRS in the United States. This was a question for you, Alex. I mean, very exciting, the presentation from the chair of Anatel a couple of days ago about the plan to offer secondary access to licensed spectrum in the 5G auctions coming up in Brazil. Can you comment on how, is that very important for you, and are you involved in discussions with Anatel about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Steve. So it's a very important decision, and if you compare with the other countries in the world, it's innovative in terms of what's planned to be done. Of course, it's not in the year 1, it's year 5 of the implementation, to give time for the operators to invest and have a return on their investment. But the 5G spectrum by itself is hard to be a small scale operator operating just the 5G spectrum in 3.5. You need to use the other spectrums. You need to use 700. You need to use 1.8. You need to use 2.1. And for that, you need to share spectrum with the operators. I showed that there are thousands of municipalities in Brazil that there is no one there, like Claude said. So there is places in everywhere that the small ISPs want to explore, but right now, at least in Brazil, we have no. It's not safe if you want to explore, because they can take back the spectrum if they want to use there. So it's good. It's very good. It's something is the right direction. But we must solve the past, because the MNOs they pile the spectrum. So they have tons of spectrum they're using or not using. We are new entrants. We cannot have the same we cannot deliver the same products they have, because they have tons of spectrum. If you just start with 5G, gonna take a while. The guys here that have operators, they know that you need to have at least the same spectrum to deliver comparable services. So we need to sum up things. It's important to have this decision of Anatel. It's the right decision, but you need to move faster in terms of sharing spectrum policies.
One thing I notice about the proposal is that is that the ISP must apply to the primary license holder first, and if an adequate response is not had from the primary holder, then they may apply to Anatel for access, secondary access. And this is, I think, contrasts a little with the UK approach in the UK with their local spectrum licenses, where you can apply directly to the regulator, and the regulator becomes the arbiter of whether secondary use or local access is allowed. A question for Michael. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
We suggested to Anatel, instead of creating like huge databases, complex databases in order to manage the spectrum, why don't we start these things in municipalities that have no one there? Because you don't need a database, because you know that no one is in that city. Why don't we explore? You don't need a database because you know that no one is there. So you can have like a sandbox, a regulatory sandbox, trying and doing like a minimal viable product, like we do, like we develop things in internet. So this is the way that you need to do.
You're preaching to the converted, Alex. Michael, a question for you. India, I mean, a market that is dominated by one very, very large operator. What do you think where do you think the opportunities are? Your quote about there's a time to speak and a time to remain silent. You said it's time to speak. Where will you speak?
So you're asking sort of two questions. One is where are the opportunities, and where is the time to speak. The interesting thing is, although that player is huge, slightly short of what tsunami it was. Interestingly, there's life after that, it's very, very interesting to see how life continued and changed after the tsunami. For those of us who are not familiar with the market in India, the market had 12 players. A new player walked into the market, caused a consolidation, which ended up with basically 3 companies in India 3 years into this. And this is after they've been offering a free connectivity or free 1.5 gigs plus free phone connection for a year to customers. So this is a case that will be studied in years to come. What happens is smaller places, the telcos, as fast as and aggressive as they roll out, do not cover them. And even when they come and they cover them, their ability, after all, again, we think of those telcos as a sort of a giant with 1,000 arms. I come from I live in a country where these gods make a daily appearance. It's not really that. It's 1,000 people with 2 arms each, right? And the problem is managing those thousands and thousands of people. And what happens is, and again, Alex was talking about it, you see deterioration as you go down the feeding chain. And even in some big cities, there's a problem. Let's not touch upon that. And that's where you come in. And I'd like to offer to Angus, a sort of a middle way here. I don't want to sound too Buddhist here. It's not about just doing good to people. You need to give good service, and you need to make good money. If you manage to hit those 2 on the head, you will survive and you will continue to give quality service. And when it comes to quality service, you need to compete with the prices. And that, Steve, that's an interesting thing because everybody manages and we manage. But just to the second one, who do you need to speak to and why do you need to speak to it? Because we're all running on a very, very limited set of tools. And again, Alex spoke about it, and to some extent, Claude spoke about it and alluded to things that he's probably trying to push in the US. As ISPs, we have a volitional toolbox, which has, 7 spectrum sets and 17 types of hardware. And in reality, we have 3 tools and 5 different types of equipment. And with that, we make do. I come from a very large country called Israel, and in Israel, one of the sayings is, this is what we have, and we will win with that. Yes, that's what we're trying to do as ISPs. But if we can push the case, and if we can make the case to governments that, look, you don't need to sacrifice the interests of the big telcos, which are very, very close to your heart. And we accept, whether it's the United States of America or Mato Grosso in Brazil or Pretoria, we accept. But there's a room for us to survive and to live side by side with those guys in this big savannah called ISPs. And that's why we need to speak.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I think with that last 5 minutes, I will offer each of you a reflection and a summing up, if you like, to close out this session and indeed to close out the summit. Who would like to go first? Claude, it looks like you really look like you're ready to say something.
Sure. Yeah, that's a small order. How to close out an entire summit of fantastic conversations. I don't know. I think the group here on this WISP panel and in the dynamic spectrum space in general, I think have really hit on a trend and an opportunity for critically important use of a critical asset of all the peoples of the world, which is radio spectrum. We've seen it used inefficiently in the past. We've seen innovators like the folks on this panel come in and use it more efficiently. I think the next phase, and we're all doing this to some extent already, is telling our story, telling what we've done, and importantly, as I mentioned before, telling what we can do in the future with the tools that we have and the tools that we're seeking to be given. You know, the upside of being not the big guy is that you're nimble, that you're forced to be lean and more efficient with what you have, and that's why I think the folks on this panel in particular have seen pretty significant success. Because we've been taking scraps of spectrum and of resources and turned them into real businesses that are serving real consumers with real service. And that gives us a fantastic baseline to tell legislators and regulators our story and say, look, if we had TV white spaces, if we had shared spectrum, if we had insert X, imagine what we could do, and I think we're in a fantastic spot to be able to do that.
Great, thank you. Angus.
Can you hear me? Good. Yeah, I love Michael's view of the Buddha's view. My wife loves Buddha and some of the teachings. So I'll say this to you though, Michael. I think the ways of making money, it's been tried before. I think people are still trying to do that. So what we have in South Africa, for example, is that service has become important to people, but now it's trying to see who's the cheapest, and you, the customer, you're sitting there, you're trying to choose which one is the best or the crappiest service that you're getting. And pricing has become that particular tool that's being used now. So if you come in cheaper, we're already sitting on crappy service. But if you are cheaper than the other, people will go there irrespective of the quality of service. So I think for me, the important thing is still to try to work towards that. As I said, I think we've got a long-term look at this here. And if we start right there at the bottom and you develop that, slowly but surely you will get there. I think in terms of the regulatory side, I think there's challenges with ICASA, obviously. Some people will say, no, it isn't, and some people will say, yes, it is here. But for me, I think it is there. I think we need to find ways to allocate spectrum to people to actually deliver services. And I think one of those is through spectrum sharing. So I think while people are still trying to figure that out, we've sat with MNOs about using the spectrum, and it's been a discussion. And it goes on, and all of a sudden it just ends. And that's the experience that we have. So I love Michael's view. I would actually love to continue having this discussion after this here with the panelists on here, because I think certainly it's very interesting when you see how people do things. But for us, I think we've got to an amazing fixed wireless, an amazing TV white space product that we can use, that we can deliver to people. We've already seen it happen. And I think now it's just a case of continuing where we left off, focus on what we said we'll focus on. People, money will be consequential to us. Hopefully I learn a few things from panelists as we go along with this journey as well. So thanks again, Steve. Thanks to everybody here.
Michael, it feels like you're next.
Okay, I've got a feeling that tonight's going to be, yeah. Sorry. I'm thinking of two things, and I think Claude took away my thunder, but that's good, and Angus to some extent. But that is to say that I'm in full agreement with what was said. So if I had to offer two things here in terms of reflections, I think that one is that the task that we are all tasking ourselves with, whether it's DSA or the people on this panel or people who took part in this conference, is we're trying to sort of bridge the what's available to pushing what's available towards what's desirable. And it's this tension, it's within this tension that we work. And you know, this is something that we need to keep on pushing and sort of never give up, you know, sit on that dirty sofa in the government office yet one more time and have lukewarm tea one more time, because you know, after 15 times you might actually get your case across, and you never know when it comes. And when the window of opportunity opens, you better be there to jump right through it and don't break your head while you're doing it. And the second thing is and I'm latching on again to this idea of us being innovative, you know, picking up the scraps and making them meaningful. Something that's coming increasingly into the conversation of connectivity is this idea of meaningful connectivity. You know, we've worked, a lot of us have been there at it for years, connecting people. And we, at least I didn't start thinking about it I was just like, connectivity is good enough. But increasingly we're getting to a place where what we do with connectivity becomes more meaningful. And IoT is again a huge title, but things that we can do with the internet are going to become much more meaningful and are already becoming. And we have a huge role to play there as ISPs, and it's also a great business to be involved with. So that's my second thought.
Right, thank you, Michael. Alex, the final word is yours.
It's hard to talk, being the last one to talk, but just want to say thank you, and the importance of this event. I want to highlight that. The only opportunity to know guys like Michael, Claude, Angus, and know their experience all over the world, what they are doing, and the importance of Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, what they are doing all over the world, and sharing these experiences. So I think this is a movement that we cannot stop. So because knowing what you're doing in US, South Africa, and other places in the world, so in Brazil, is the most important thing. So, and this is a thing that we need to connect ourselves to share experience as we are sharing spectrum. So this is my final words. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That's a great way of closing things out, and a privilege to share this panel with all of you. I'd like to thank the DSA for allowing me to participate in this event, and in particular Martha Suarez, and to invite Martha to come back and offer a closing word.
Thank you very much, Steve, and all the panelists. It was really exciting to hear you, and I really like the conclusion, like, let's try to share experiences as we are sharing Spectrum. And it's really amazing to see everything you are doing with the tools that you just have right now. So I don't imagine what else you could be doing in terms of connectivity if we could have more access to Spectrum on a balanced way, like making sure that all the players have the right to play. So thank you very much for your presentations. Really appreciate it. And it has been something that we have been wanting to do for a while at the DSA. So I'm really glad that we finally had this panel with all of you. Unfortunately, I think we are very close to the end of the DSA summit. It has been a really, really exciting agenda. At least that's what we have seen with many participants, with different stakeholders from all around the world. And even if it was just 5 sessions, I feel like there is a lot of material and information that we will all have to process afterwards. So I wanted to thank you. I would like to thank our sponsors that have kindly supported the DSA Summit. So in that case, Microsoft, Internet Society, Facebook, HPE Aruba, Amazon, Cisco, and Google. Thank you very much for the support. Also, thank you very much, Steve, for being the Master of Ceremonies, and Jen and Jeff, who was also the Master of Ceremony for the Asia Pacific session. I would like also to thank all the team that has been working on this and making sure that we have all the sessions and we stick on time, and all the details that usually we don't see as participants. And a big thank you also to all the speakers. You have prepared these sessions, which you have kindly shared your insights and updates from different perspectives. And I think that's what it is about. It's about hearing the good practices and challenges from regulators, and also share the experiences with industry and different stakeholders. So I think at the end, we are very glad to see that we are accomplishing that purpose. The slides and all the material has been shared at the DSA website, so you can already download the slides of those speakers if you want to review the material. We will also publish all the video soon, so probably tomorrow by the end of the day, you should be able to watch all the video and the content. And right now, there are also in our YouTube channel, there are 3 pre-recorded sessions that I invite you to watch. There is one about the new collaboration partnership, the new collaboration framework that the DSA has with the FCDO in the UK. So I really invite you to take a look at that. Also, we have some updates about the urban initiative from Microsoft, and a special webinar organized by ISOC, where we have learned about Colnodo and the activities that they have been doing for community networks in Buenos Aires, Cauca, in Colombia. So thank you very much again, and well, I hope next year we will be able to meet each other, hopefully in a face-to-face event. That's our hope, but let's see how everything continues, and please stay safe and take care. Thank you very much.